Congresswoman, welcome back to the program. Your bill is called the Protecting Reproductive Freedom Act. If passed, the way I understand it, it would essentially protect the availability of mifepristone nationally and override any state laws that might pop up. But Republicans maintain that narrow majority in the House. Where do you see a path for victory to get this approved, or is this just simply to keep the issue alive?
Well, thanks, Jason, for the question, and thanks for having me here. I think it's really important that we build a coalition around this bill and the effort that we have here that's reflected in our bill, the Protecting Reproductive Freedom Act, because what we see is that this case that was decided in the Northern District of Texas, now partially stayed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, is really part of this ongoing effort to take away our freedom to make our own decisions about our bodies, our families, our futures, and our ability to have access to both information and resources and care that enable us to do that. And very much this bill speaks to that because it's not only about access to abortion, which it certainly is, but it's also about the threats to our established drug approval system. And so that's a really important piece of this bill, that the FDA has approved this drug more than 20 years ago, that it is the drug that is used in more than 50% of abortions in states where it's still legal. Obviously, that's not the case for us in Texas. But what we see is that the opinion that we saw from the Supreme Court, from the Fifth Circuit this week, prevents the very things that have made it accessible, like being able to get the prescription through telehealth, getting rid of the in-person requirement to get it. Those are the kinds of things that our bill protects. And it's about protecting access to this medication and protecting the FDA's authority to regulate drugs across the United States.
The U.S. Department of Justice says it's now going to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to step in on this case here. The court has a conservative majority. For those of us outside the Beltway here, should the Supreme Court take the case, are you concerned what its ruling might be?
Well, I think we saw last summer what the Supreme Court's ruling, the effect that the Dobbs decision had across the country. And of course, we should all be concerned because what we see is an absolute assault on our individual rights that we as Texans hold dear. But I think here the Department of Justice is right? And what we've seen both from the district court in Texas and from the Fifth Circuit, even though the Fifth Circuit stay provides some immediate relief, it really reinforces some dubious legal arguments. It undermines drug approval at the FDA, which creates chaos across the board. And of course, it limits access to mifepristone to the Americans who need it. So I think the Department of Justice is taking the right step in seeking emergency relief from the Supreme Court. But as you noted, we have seen the decisions coming out of the courts. There has to be a legislative solution here. And this matters to people across our country and certainly across the state of Texas. Research from the University of Texas showed last summer only 15% of Texans support the state of the law in Texas as it is today, with essentially a total ban on abortion. Only 15% of Texans. So there is a legislative solution here too. We've got to pass these protections in our legislatures, and we have to vote for people who are going to do that and who are going to protect our rights.
Yeah, the voting part seems like the bottom line here. You called the ruling by the federal judge in Fort Worth potentially catastrophic. Couldn't women, though, still get this same medication, the mifepristone or other similar medication from overseas?
Well, what this does is prevents the approval for use in the United States. And so that is how the vast majority of American women get their health care at a trusted provider who is operating here in the United States. And frankly, there's no reason to do it. I mean, going back to the fundamentals here, the FDA has said this is safe and effective medication, that it has fewer complications than Tylenol. We're talking about a safe and effective medication. So really what this is is about making it more difficult for women to access the health care that they need. And don't forget, this is an important medication for women who are having miscarriages. And we see that in Texas. We see women having miscarriages being sent home from the hospital because of the draconian state of our laws in Texas at this moment. And so this is about restricting our access to care, to safe and effective medication and reproductive health care, which is essential health care for women across Texas and across the United States.
One last question here for you too. The outcome of this legal case here could have, far. Let me rephrase that. The outcome of this legal case here could impact a lot more than just mifepristone and the access to abortion. The FDA's approval process you mentioned early on there is at stake as well. Explain how.
Well, that's exactly right, because this case centers around mifepristone, but other medicines that have been previously approved by the FDA could be at risk. And so this could have massive implications for the drug approval process. That's why you've seen, I think, more than 200 pharmaceutical manufacturers also signed on to a letter this week denouncing the decision. I signed on to a amicus brief in the Fifth Circuit because it's both access to this medication and our reproductive health care, but it is also protecting the system at the FDA and having scientists rather than politicians making these decisions about approving drugs and about healthcare. And that is consistent with the views of the majority of Americans who believe that healthcare decisions should be made between patients and their physicians. They should not be made by politicians sitting in Washington or in Austin. And what we see here is a real effort by a group of plaintiffs and a single judge to undo this very rigorous drug approval system. That will cause chaos. And if there's one thing I hear consistently from people in my district and across the state, we want to understand the rules of the road. We want to be able to predict as we are operating, whether it's operating our businesses, operating our lives, what are the rules of the road? How do we move forward? And the idea that you could challenge the FDA's drug approval process in this way really causes chaos. And the other thing I just want to add to that is there is a system to remove drugs from the market if they are not safe and effective. That process also goes through the FDA. And so this is really about protecting the FDA's authority as well as the health and freedom and dignity of Americans.
Congresswoman Fletcher, we appreciate the time. We'll be watching this bill. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to see you.